The Midwest is perhaps one of America's most underrated and misunderstood regions. It includes some of the country's most progressive and modern cities, while also being home to some of the most religious and backwards places north of the Mason-Dixon line. As someone who grew up in the Midwest and spent a fair amount of time in all 12 states that make up the region, I have lived experiences with the best and worst that this part of the USA has to offer. And today, we are going to focus on the former by taking a deeper dive into the 6 best Midwestern states for LGBTQ people in 2024. Now, the methodology we will employ to create this list is simple. We begin with the 2 most trusted and comprehensive resources for the measuring of LGBTQ rights: the Movement Advancement Project and EqualDex. Now, the Movement Advancement Project awards points for both sexual orientation and gender identity-related legislation and covers 7 different broader legal categories. The maximum points that a state can earn is 44.5, so as an example, a score above 40 would be nearly perfect. EqualDex, on the other hand, awards a maximum of 100 points, and importantly, also takes public opinion data into account along with legislation. Each state's scores from both the Movement Advancement Project and EqualDex are then combined and averaged out so that we have a well-rounded final ranking that takes nearly every possible factor into account. I find it vital to always use multiple sources of high reputation instead of relying on only one, as to make certain that we are getting the absolute best data covering the widest range of relevant metrics possible. Also, for those who, like me, enjoy digging deeper into the data, you can find links in the description to both primary sources. The information linked below is incredibly interesting to look through, plus, if you are curious about a specific state from a different region that I do not cover in this video, you can easily do that. And now, we begin our journey into the best Midwestern states for LGBTQ people with a state that until recently had a pretty solid reputation as a leading Democratic stronghold and champion of queer rights in the region: Iowa. Unfortunately, despite this quite progressive heritage, in recent years Iowa has shifted into a firmly conservative state, which is especially disheartening when we consider that in 2009, Iowa became the 4th state in the US to achieve marriage equality, only behind California, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, and even ahead of countries like Sweden, Iceland, Argentina, and Denmark. This coincided with the time frame in which Iowa was still a solid blue state. In fact, before 2016, Iowa had only voted for a Republican candidate in one election since 1988. But since 2016, Iowa has made a massive rightward shift and is no longer the bastion of liberty and openness that it seemed to be turning into in the late 2000s, and the data backs this up. The Movement Advancement Project gives Iowa an overall score of 12.5 out of 44.5, with its performance on sexual orientation legislation predictably outpacing its score on gender identity. And while 12.5 out of 44.5 certainly sounds pretty terrible, and it is definitely not great, it is worth pointing out that 16 states have scores below 0 and in the negatives, so positive 12.5 is slightly better than it sounds, while still leaving lots of room for improvement. Comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation in the state protects Iowans from both sexual orientation and gender identity-related discrimination, and LGBTQ youth are also covered by similar laws against discrimination and bullying. But despite these protections, Iowa bans the discussion of LGBTQ subjects and people in schools, and, most barbarically of all, teachers are required by law to out trans kids to their parents, often leading to abuse at home. Conversion therapy is also not banned in the state, and so many children who are outed to their parents against their will end up being sent to conversion therapy camps where they are subjected to psychological torture and even physical abuse in the name of making them no longer admit to being LGBTQ. In light of all this, Iowa's anti-discrimination laws seem like a joke, as they do not protect the most vulnerable in society and allow for parents to discriminate, bully, and abuse their queer children freely and with no repercussions. Iowa also does not yet ban the panic defense argument from being made in court, which is essentially a shockingly evil practice where an individual kills a member of the LGBTQ community and then claims in court that they did it because they panicked when they found out the person they killed was queer. Furthermore, trans individuals are only allowed to change their gender markers on important legal documents if they have first undergone sex reassignment surgery. And no third or non-binary gender marker option is available on official documentation in the state, highlighting just how much work still needs to be done in Iowa before it is even a decent place for our community. The only reasons why Iowa makes it onto this list, and thus beating out the 6 worst Midwestern states, is due to its robust anti-discrimination laws, anti-hate crime laws, and relatively progressive laws on adoption and fostering by LGBTQ families. Most of the negative laws in the state target trans people and LGBTQ youth in particular, a trend seen across nearly all Republican states, and one that causes immense suffering and death in the community. Now, Equaldex gives Iowa a score of 70, and if Iowa were an independent country, that would place the state on par with countries like Italy, the UK, Switzerland, and Nepal. Far from terrible, but equally far from great. Marriage equality and a relatively high score in public opinion data are 2 of the main contributing factors to Iowa's overall decent score. Now, as someone who has spent a good bit of time in Iowa over the years, I can honestly say that the scores it receives across these metrics line up closely with what I have experienced. Like most states in the country, the rural areas of Iowa are extremely religious, anti-queer, and right-wing. But many good places still exist in the state, like its capital, Des Moines, which is quite a peaceful, safe, and affordable city by national standards, and also regarded as being LGBTQ friendly. Iowa City is also very progressive, one of America's most educated cities, and is full of small-town charm. Cedar Rapids, Davenport, and Ames are also quite progressive cities that routinely vote blue in elections and have a reputation as being pro-LGBTQ as well. Additionally, on the border with Illinois is the city of Burlington, and I am always surprised by how many pride flags I have seen when passing through. It is a cute town with many historic buildings still standing that take you back to another time. As for natural beauty, Iowa is not home to any mountains, large lakes, unique forests, or any national park for that matter. And while the state certainly does have pockets of acceptance, it is not a state that I recommend anyone in the community rushing to visit anytime soon, which is sad, considering that 15 years ago, it was perhaps one of the most progressive states in the country. Hopefully one day, Iowa can once again reclaim this designation, but it undoubtedly has a long way to go. Moving now to the eastern edge of the Midwestern region, we arrive in a state that, similar to Iowa, had a reputation for being a relatively moderate state throughout the recent past, Ohio. Unfortunately, like Iowa, since 2016, Ohio has become ever more hostile to our community and has started to more fully embrace religious and traditionalist politics with bills targeting queer rights. But despite its negative trajectory, Ohio still has managed to secure the rank of 5th best Midwestern state for our community out of the 12 states in the region, largely owing to its pre-MAGA era policies and to the fact that the other 7 states in the Midwest are even worse. The Movement Advancement Project gives Ohio an overall score of 7.75 out of 44.5, and notably, we once again see that policy relating to gender identity is far behind sexual orientation legislation. On a positive note, Ohio does have anti-discrimination laws in place which cover the entire community. Additionally, it is possible for trans people to change their gender markers on official documentation without surgery, and non-binary individuals are able to select the letter X for their birth certificates, but not yet for their driver's license. Queer families seeking to adopt and foster children are also protected from discrimination, but this is essentially where the good laws end. Conversion therapy targeting youth is not banned at the state level, but 21% of Ohio's population do live in a jurisdiction where conversion therapy for minors is banned, which is definitely a start. But tragically, the barbaric panic defense argument being made in court is still possible in Ohio, and the state has no hate crime laws covering LGBTQ people either. And while Ohio does have extensive anti-discrimination laws covering its adult population, these protections do not apply to queer students in school. Furthermore, there are no anti-LGBTQ bullying laws in place within Ohio's public school system either. And while, as stated earlier, gender-affirming care and changing one's legal gender are possible for adults in the state, there are still many barriers when it comes to trans healthcare, both for adults and children, which when combined make Ohio a subpar choice for trans and non-binary individuals in particular. Now, Equaldex gives Ohio a score of 75, meaning that if it were an independent country, it would be tied with countries like Cuba, New Zealand, France, and Austria. This may be hard to imagine, considering the negative areas of policy we have just covered, but all things considered, Ohio still has marriage equality, queer adoption and fostering rights, the ability for trans adults to change their legal gender without surgery, and pro-LGBTQ public opinion rates that are extremely high by global standards. So while there is certainly much work to be done, especially in areas like accessible trans healthcare, banning conversion therapy, and scrapping the panic defense argument, along with expanding rights for trans youth, Ohio still comes in with an admirable score compared to most of the world, including most liberal democracies. Now, growing up in the Midwest, I have had the opportunity to visit most of Ohio's large cities, all of which are accepting and nearly always vote for progressive candidates. Columbus, the capital of Ohio, is quite a gorgeous city, especially architecturally speaking, and is very LGBTQ friendly. Cincinnati, the third largest city in the state, shares these progressive ideals, and its downtown is definitely an interesting and beautiful place to explore. In the far north of the state, along the coast of Lake Erie, is the city of Cleveland, another center of acceptance in Ohio and worth a visit if you were ever in the region. Like most U.S. states, the rural parts of Ohio tend to be quite backward socially and likewise anti-LGBTQ, but the Amish parts of the state are undoubtedly interesting to see at least once in life. The architecture, culture, and food products in the Amish areas are an intriguing mix of 1800s American and German culture. But despite Ohio definitely having some visually stunning and modern cities, along with the picturesque countryside, the growing sway of conservative Christian traditionalism in the state and backsliding on trans issues in particular mean that ultimately Ohio is not a state I would recommend rushing to anytime soon. Especially as the final 4 states on this list offer many of the same draws as Ohio, but with far better environments for our community and overall more accepting populations. Moving northwest now, we arrive in a state that marks a turning point on this list, where each remaining state is genuinely a pretty great place to be queer. Wisconsin secures the rank of 4th best Midwestern state for LGBTQ people by a full 5 points, which is truly a noticeable rise from Ohio. Interestingly, Wisconsin introduced marriage equality in 2014, a year before the entire USA did, and even before countries like Germany, Finland, and Australia. The Movement Advancement Project gives Wisconsin a score of 17.75, and even though it practically goes without saying at this point, Wisconsin has also made more progress on laws relating to sexual orientation than gender identity. 100% of the state's population is covered by anti-discrimination laws relating to sexual orientation, but only 21% of the state is fully protected from gender identity-based discrimination. Unfortunately, Wisconsin has not yet banned conversion therapy for minors at the state level, but progress is being made, and a statewide ban will likely be coming in the near future. Until then, 24% of its population already live in areas where this cruel practice is banned. It is currently possible for trans people to change their gender marker on their driver's license without surgery being required, but it is not yet possible to do so on birth certificates. Also, gender-neutral options are not yet possible on official documentation in Wisconsin, but hopefully this will be changing in the near future. Trans healthcare in the state is quite accessible, state employees have access to trans-inclusive health benefits, private healthcare providers and Medicaid are required to be trans-inclusive, and there are no bans on age-appropriate gender-affirming care for minors, which, contrary to Republican talking points, does not include surgeries. That narrative is deceptive propaganda. While Wisconsin's LGBTQ laws are overall quite decent, and in some specific areas even approach perfection, perhaps the most pressing legal issue remaining in the state is the fact that using the panic defense argument in court has not yet been banned, something that will hopefully be remedied in the very near future, as it has been done in 3 of Wisconsin's 4 neighboring states already. Now, Wisconsin scores 75 points from Equaldex, meaning that if it were independent, it would place alongside famously LGBTQ-friendly countries. Additionally, with its public opinion score of 67, only 9 countries on Earth would have more accepting populations. And on top of its solid showing across the metrics, Wisconsin is also an incredibly beautiful state with so much to offer. The capital, Madison, is overwhelmingly progressive, visually stunning, and home to highly regarded educational institutions. The largest city in the state is Milwaukee, and like Madison, it also has a very accepting and forward-thinking population, boasting incredible architecture and a thriving brewery scene. For those who are not quite city people, Wisconsin also has many other draws, such as its cheese scene. And yes, for those who do not already know, some of the best cheese in the world is made in this Midwestern state. Additionally, Wisconsin's natural beauty is breathtaking, especially its caves and coastal areas along Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. And while no state is perfect, Wisconsin is definitely moving in the right direction. Moving one state over now to the east, we arrive in the third best Midwestern state for LGBTQ people in 2024, Michigan. Beyond its slight mistake in 2016, Michigan has voted for Democratic presidential candidates nearly 30 years in a row. And, at the state level, it is also led by progressive lawmakers. And so it is no surprise at all that the state is not only a regional leader in queer rights, but is even making a stand for our community on the national stage as well. The Movement Advancement Project gives Michigan a score of 26 out of 44.5, more than 8 points higher than Wisconsin, and over 18 points above Ohio. Also, for the first time in this list, we see that progress in both sexual orientation and gender identity legislation is nearly equal in the state. Furthermore, 100% of Michigan's population is protected by anti-discrimination laws covering both sexual orientation and gender identity. Conversion therapy for minors is also completely banned in the state, and LGBTQ children have specific protections within the child welfare system as to not be placed with anti-queer adults. Private health insurance providers and state Medicaid are required to offer trans-inclusive healthcare coverage and abide by non-discrimination laws. There are also no bans on age-appropriate gender-affirming care for minors. Speaking of which, trans individuals are able to change their legal gender markers on all official documentation without the need for any medical interventions, and gender-neutral options are also available on such documents. Furthermore, just this year, Michigan finally banned the panic defense argument from being made in court, which is honestly a hugely important deal and makes Michigan a far safer state for our entire community. It is also interesting to point out that with a score of 82 on Equaldex, Michigan would be tied with Spain for LGBTQ rights if it were an independent country, and only behind 3 other countries in the entire world. Now, when I was young, I actually lived in Michigan for about 3 years, and since then I've had the chance to visit various parts of this beautiful state. The western coast of Michigan, along Lake Michigan, is home to many beautiful small towns like Holland and Saugatuck, which, on top of being quite charming, are also famous for being very queer-friendly. The northern portion of the state is full of stunning wilderness, much of which is sparsely populated and pristine. In fact, Michigan is home to one of the few national parks in the Midwestern region, and Isle Royale National Park is so remote that it is only accessible by ferry, seaplane, or private watercraft, as no roads connect to the island. And finally, the infamous city of Detroit has actually been making a pretty major comeback in recent years, with falling crime rates and soaring investments into the city. Detroit is also an increasingly progressive city, quite LGBTQ friendly, and despite its very visible and widely reported on shortcomings, this Midwestern city seems to be moving in the right direction in more ways than one. Of course, there is not nearly enough time to cover everything that the state of over 10 million people has to offer, but for those in our community interested in exploring the Midwest, or looking for a more affordable part of the USA to call home, Michigan is an excellent state to consider. Now, before we finish with the best 2 Midwestern states for our community in 2024, I just wanted to ask you personally to become a citizen of the Queer Kingdom if you support what we do. Your help fighting for our future and building a strong, informed community is vital for our quest of making the world a safer place for our people. You can officially join the Kingdom here on YouTube for $1 a month, which will help me make this channel my full-time focus as soon as possible. The more time I can spend on content creation, the better I can serve the community. You will also get access to some cute custom queer emojis and epic crown icons next to your comments on this channel that change and evolve the longer you are a member. Also, monthly live streams are always public, but they are eventually moved to the members-only feed afterwards, and controversial videos covering heavy subjects that are not quite YouTube-friendly are also privately posted for citizens of the Kingdom so that we can all stay informed. And finally, joining the Queer Kingdom here on YouTube gives you the ability to chat with me and fellow members through access to our new Queer Kingdom Discord. I look forward to meeting you and working with you to create a safe and prosperous world for our people, one step at a time. Moving now to the home state of vice presidential candidate Tim Walz, we arrive in Minnesota. Walz has made his pro-LGBTQ credentials a sizable part of the Harris-Walz presidential campaign, and his record as governor of Minnesota definitely backs this up, as the state more than comfortably secures the rank of second best Midwestern state for queer people out of the 12 states in the region. In fact, with a score from the Movement Advancement Project of 37, Minnesota is 11 points ahead of Michigan, 20 points ahead of Wisconsin, and 30 points ahead of Ohio by this metric. Clearly, Governor Walz is not messing around with his support for our community. 100% of Minnesota's population is covered by anti-discrimination laws for both sexual orientation and gender identity. The state also has robust anti-hate crime laws and has banned the panic defense argument from being made in court. Interestingly, not only has conversion therapy for minors been banned at the state level, but a further 19% of the population is also covered by additional layers of local protections, which is really incredible to see. Minnesota also has an essentially perfect record in terms of trans healthcare and access to such healthcare. And it is possible for trans people to change their gender markers on legal documentation without any barriers such as surgery. A gender-neutral option is also available on driver's license, but not yet on birth certificates. And lastly, its laws relating to queer families are also nearly perfect, with only some minor areas remaining where improvements could be made. It is no surprise then that Equaldex gives Minnesota a score of 83, meaning that if it were its own country, Minnesota would be tied with Uruguay as the third best country on Earth for LGBTQ rights behind only Iceland and Norway. Now, Minnesota is a pretty large state by land area and is absolutely full of incredible things to do and see. The Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area is one of the most progressive and open in the country, and is also home to some incredible architecture. Voyageurs National Park is also located within the state, and in the winter it is even possible to enjoy the majestic northern lights. On top of this, Voyageurs National Park is also home to what may be some of the best kayaking in the world. The western portion of the state, especially along the border with North Dakota, is home to some gorgeous Nordic architecture and remnants of the rich culture that settlers from northern Europe brought to the state. Like most of the country, the sparsely populated areas of Minnesota remain quite conservative, but the majority of the population lives in open and accepting cities like Duluth, Rochester, Moorhead, and Mankato, and, of course, the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area. These cities and others are strong enough to keep the state moving in the right direction. Considering that only 2 countries in the world are better for LGBTQ rights than Minnesota, and that 71% of respondents in the state are firm supporters of our community's right to exist safely and freely, which, mind you, is 10 points higher than public opinion in countries like Germany, the UK, and Portugal, it is clear that Minnesota is a place that every queer person should absolutely have on their radar. And finally, we come to the winner of the Midwest, the state with the highest population, largest economy, and yes, also the best score for LGBTQ rights, the state of Illinois. Ever since 1992, Illinois has consistently voted for Democratic presidential candidates, and due to its large urban centers, state-level politics have also been firmly under Democratic control for decades. This has led to such a flourishing in LGBTQ rights in the state that now Illinois not only has some of the best laws in the country, but even in the entire world. The Movement Advancement Project gives Illinois an astounding 38 points, excelling in both sexual orientation and gender identity legislation. Every positive law mentioned for Minnesota is true in Illinois as well, and the entire state is covered by anti-discrimination laws. Conversion therapy for minors and the panic defense argument being made in court are also banned, and trans healthcare is accessible without restrictions, along with the changing of one's gender markers on legal documentation. LGBTQ children are also fully safeguarded in the state schools, foster care and adoption systems, and from anti-queer parents. Curriculum in schools across the state must also be LGBTQ inclusive. Perhaps the only negative laws remaining in the state are a handful of religious exemptions, essentially allowing for certain forms of discrimination for people who whine and cry about their fairy tales telling them to be hateful to others. But beyond these minor exemptions for some religious zealots, Illinois' laws truly approach perfection. In light of all this, it is not surprising that Equaldex has given Illinois a score of 84, ranking 3rd in the world if it were its own country, and beating out Uruguay by 1 point. As mentioned earlier, I spent many of my formative years in the Midwest, and this meant that Chicago was always the nearest large city. And while the city is famously dragged for its struggles with gangs and crime, especially in its outskirts, as a whole, Chicago is a visually stunning place with incredible restaurants, concerts, museums, and views of Lake Michigan. Of course, it is also one of the most LGBTQ-friendly cities in the world and home to the famous neighborhood known as Boys Town. Outside of the Chicago metro area, there are certainly pockets of acceptance and progressive ideals, but as a rule, the majority of Illinois remains quite conservative, despite the incredible legal situation in the state. And while there are definitely some beautiful natural areas in the state, such as Shawnee National Forest, the major draw of Illinois is undoubtedly Chicago, especially for our community. Ultimately, the top 4 states on this list are all genuinely great places to either visit or even to call home. Not only because they are more affordable than the national average, but also because they are true leaders in progressive ideals and queer rights. In a region that is often overlooked and assumed to be entirely full of religious fanatics and uneducated bigots, these states break from stereotypes and set an example the entire country and world should follow. And now, for today's queer news story, we have a disheartening update from the country of Georgia, where the government has just pushed through the final iteration of its anti-LGBTQ bill. Now, this is a story that I covered in depth a couple of months back before the bill had officially come into force. And if you want more context, this video is currently only available to members, as it falls into the category of more heavy and controversial subjects and was heavily restricted by YouTube. But back to the story. The now active law in the Russian puppet state of Georgia includes bans on any future passing of same-sex marriage, bans all adoptions by same-sex couples, and makes the public endorsement and depictions of LGBTQ relationships and people in the media a criminal offense. Even having a rainbow flag in a social media bio is enough to be arrested now. The bill also bans gender-affirming care and changing gender markers in official documentation, even if sex reassignment surgery has been completed. The president of Georgia, who is perhaps the only politician with any power left in the country who has not been bought by Russia, refused to sign the bill into law earlier this week, but the Speaker of the Georgian Parliament, a radical religious and pro-Russian orc, went ahead and signed the bill instead, bypassing the president. Now, many polls find that up to 80% of Georgian youth oppose Russia's control over the country's government and dream of a future in the EU. But these new developments have made such a future impossible in the near term, as Georgia is now simply another Belarus or Transnistria. I actually spent a brief amount of time in Tbilisi last year before it was clear that freedom and democracy had lost in the country, and back when there was still hope, at this time, that justice and liberty would prevail. But unfortunately, things are likely to only keep getting worse in the country before they get better, and boycotting Georgia in terms of tourism, investment, and the buying of products produced in the country is all we can really do at this time to make the country's government understand the consequences of rejecting human rights. I'm glad to say that my stay in the country was extremely brief and my expenditure minimal. Hopefully, LGBTQ Georgians will be able to find a way out to a safe country as soon as possible, where they are appreciated rather than persecuted. And hopefully, Georgia's leaders will one day taste their own medicine to the fullest extent. Thank you, friends, for watching and spending time today with me as we seek to spread the word about important topics in the community. For those interested, you are more than welcome to stay around and join our increasingly powerful kingdom here on YouTube as we fight for our future. Until next time, QK out.